In the spring of 1930, 4 identical baby girls were born in Lansing, Michigan. And with them entered a darkness that would cast its shadow over American psychiatry for nearly a century. The Morlock Quadruplets became instant celebrities. Their angelic faces splashed across newspapers from coast to coast. But behind that polished, carefully orchestrated public image was a house of horrors. One that would push all 4 sisters into madness before their 24th birthday. What really happened in that small, clapboard home on Lansing's east side? And why did government researchers spend decades studying these women while turning a blind eye to the Nazi-sympathizer who terrorized them? For years, case files sat sealed in government archives. What they reveal is a story so disturbing that even seasoned psychiatrists struggled to write down the full scope of what they had uncovered. Here were 4 identical children, born into what looked like a loving American family, yet their lives were systematically destroyed by a father whose obsession with racial purity and patriarchal control created a laboratory of psychological torture, making his daughters infamous for all the wrong reasons. Before we continue with the Morlock family's descent into what scientists would later call dire birth, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. Because this American nightmare, it could have happened anywhere. The warning signs were there, hidden in plain sight. In a community that chose to look away rather than confront the darkness festering behind white picket fences. The birth announcement that would change everything appeared in the Lansing State Journal on May 19, 1930, but few could have predicted the decades of exploitation and suffering that would follow. Lansing in 1930 was a city caught between 2 worlds. Its smokestack skyline rose above tree-lined residential streets where the American dream was supposed to flourish. The capital of Michigan had grown rapidly during the automotive boom, drawing families like Carl and Sadie Morlock from across the Midwest with promises of steady work and middle-class respectability. The Oldsmobile factory employed thousands, its assembly lines running day and night to meet the ever-growing demand for automobiles, a shining symbol of American prosperity. But Lansing's neighborhoods reflected the era's deep social divides. On the west side lived the professional class: doctors, lawyers, factory managers in large Victorian homes with manicured lawns and wraparound porches. The east side, where the Morlocks eventually settled, housed factory workers, recent immigrants, and families still climbing toward respectability. The homes were smaller, but well kept. Owners took pride in fresh coats of paint, polished windows, and gardens blooming with the same flowers their neighbors planted. Carl Morlock himself had arrived in America as a boy. Traveling with his German immigrant mother, Bertha, she filled his head with stories of German superiority and warnings about America. Being corrupted by inferior peoples, Bertha had her own demons. As a teenager, she suffered what doctors at the time called a nervous breakdown, spending 3 years in and out of psychiatric hospitals. The experience left her with paranoid delusions about racial contamination and wild conspiracy theories, ideas she passed on to her son like a poisoned inheritance. Carl worked as a laborer at the Oldsmobile plant. His thick accent and harsh demeanor won him few friends. Those who knew him described a man consumed by paranoid obsessions about protecting his family's purity and reputation. Most dismissed his occasional outbursts as eccentricities, quirks of a foreign-born patriarch struggling to fit into American life. To his supervisors, Carl was reliable, but distant. He avoided socializing, often eating lunch alone while poring over German-language newspapers that arrived weeks late from overseas. Before his marriage, he had lived in a grim 3-story boarding house crammed with 24 single immigrant men working the city's factories. His room was sparse, but obsessively tidy. Religious icons covered one wall. Photographs of German landscapes covered another. Fellow boarders recalled him as quiet but intense pacing at night, muttering in German, as if arguing with invisible enemies. In 1925, Carl met Sadie Mueller at a church social. She was drawn to his serious demeanor and old-world courtesies. Sadie was 22, the daughter of a railroad worker killed in an accident when she was 16. her mother remarried quickly, leaving Sadi unwelcome in her stepfather's home. For her, marriage meant escape and stability. Their courtship was traditional. Sunday visits in her family's parlor under her mother's watchful eye. Karl spoke little, but his attention was fixed and unwavering. He brought her flowers, chocolates, even German poetry books she couldn't read, but treasured nonetheless. After 6 months, he proposed. Sadi, craving security, eagerly accepted. Their November 1925 wedding at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church was modest, attended by her family and a few of Karl's co-workers. The reception took place in the church basement. Sandwiches and coffee on white tablecloths that Sadi herself had embroidered. Karl's mother, Bertha, sat alone in the corner most of the evening, watching the crowd with suspicion. The newlyweds rented a small apartment above a bakery on Lansing's east side. The smell of fresh bread and pastries filled their early married days. Sadi poured herself into making a warm home, sewing curtains, arranging furniture, learning to cook Karl's favorite German dishes. But Karl's temperament soon showed itself. In public, he played the part of the respectable worker. At home, his controlling nature ruled. He monitored Sadi's every move, questioned her about conversations with neighbors, and set strict rules for everything from how she dressed to what radio shows she could listen to. He claimed these restrictions were necessary to protect her from corrupting influences and to uphold proper German-American family standards. Karl allowed her to attend church, but always accompanied her, positioning himself where he could watch her interactions. Friendships with neighbors were discouraged. Karl insisted most Americans lacked moral standards and might plant dangerous ideas in her head about women's independence. When Sadi discovered she was pregnant in late 1929, Karl's reaction was conflicted. He wanted heirs to carry his name, but feared the financial strain and the attention children might draw to his tightly guarded household. When doctors began to suspect multiple births, based on Sadi's rapid weight gain and swollen abdomen, Karl's anxiety intensified. To him, multiple births were a mark of lower breeding, something fit for livestock, not for a respectable German-American family. His mother's obsession with racial purity only deepened his paranoia. The cultural backdrop of 1930, America, only fueled what was to come. The Great Depression was worsening, families were desperate, and President Hoover's promises of prosperity rang hollow. Hollywood glamorized child stars like Shirley Temple, proving children could become lucrative assets. Radio and newsreels celebrated large families as symbols of divine blessing. Meanwhile, eugenics movements quietly whispered about genetic superiority and the dangers of contamination from inferior blood. On the morning of May 19, 1930, Sadi's contractions began early. She was hanging laundry in the small backyard when sharp pains stopped her in her tracks. Karl had already left for work, grumbling about overtime. The pains grew quickly, alarmingly frequent. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow downstairs, heard Sadi's cries. She called her nephew, Dr. William Henderson, a local physician who served Lansing's working-class families. A neighbor was sent to find Karl at the Oldsmobile plant, but by then Sadi was deep into labor. Dr. Henderson loaded her into his Model T, blankets and pillows, turning it into a makeshift ambulance. The hour-long ride through traffic and construction was agonizing. By the time they reached Edward W. Sparrow Hospital, her contractions were relentless. Sparrow Hospital was Lansing's premier facility, a 4-story brick building serving all of central Michigan. Sadi was admitted to a semi-private room, standard for families of modest means. Dr. Henderson had delivered hundreds of babies, but nothing prepared him for this. Labor stretched for 16 brutal hours. Nurses whispered about the unusual size of her abdomen and the strange heartbeats echoing through their stethoscopes. At last, one infant emerged. But Henderson quickly realized more were coming. 20 minutes later, another, then a third, and finally, a reluctant fourth. Each girl was remarkably similar, around 4 pounds. Delicate features, wisps of blonde hair catching the harsh hospital lights. Their synchronized cries seemed almost uncanny, as though they were already communicating in ways adults could never understand. Quadruplets. were astronomically rare, perhaps 1 in 15 million births. Henderson knew survival rates were low. Yet, against all odds, these 4 appeared strong and healthy. When Carl finally arrived, pulled from a frantic search at the factory floor, and even several taverns where he was known to drink, his first words would echo through the family's tragic history. "What will they think my wife is? A dog?" he shouted, face red with alcohol and fury. "This is what happens to animals, not to decent Christian families." The nurses exchanged looks of disgust. Henderson quickly pulled the father aside into a private room, because what had just begun would soon spiral into one of the darkest chapters Lansing had ever known. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Henderson patiently explained to Carl Morlock what had just taken place. "Your wife has given birth to 4 identical girls. This is incredibly rare, perhaps 1 in 15 million births. They're a medical marvel. And more importantly, they're all healthy and strong." But Carl's face only darkened. Fury simmered beneath his expression, anger that seemed wildly out of proportion to the moment. In his mind, multiple births were tied to animals, the breeding practices he'd seen on farms as a boy in rural Michigan. The thought of neighbors whispering that his wife had produced a litter filled him with a rage that would fester for decades, poisoning every corner of his family's future. The babies, initially labeled only as Baby A, Baby B, Baby C, and Baby D, were placed in the hospital nursery while Sadie recovered from her grueling delivery. Nurses, overwhelmed by the novelty of 4 identical infants, whispered in amazement as word spread quickly through the hospital. By dawn, reporters had already begun to gather outside. The Lansing State Journal broke the story that very afternoon. Miracle quadruplets born at Sparrow. A black and white photograph showed the 4 tiny girls in a row, dressed in identical white hospital gowns. The article called them perfect specimens of American childhood and celebrated their birth as a beacon of hope in an era of deep economic despair. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Strangers poured into the hospital, reporters, photographers, curious onlookers, all demanding a glimpse of the miracle babies. The hospital switchboard lit up with calls from newspapers across the country. Gifts began arriving: blankets, clothes, toys, even cash donations from families who themselves could barely afford to eat, but felt compelled to support what they saw as a divine blessing. That afternoon, Lansing's mayor, Harold Thompson, arrived for a photo op. He declared May 19, 1930, Quadruplet Day, in honor of the city's newest celebrities. He announced that the Morlocks would receive a rent-free home for 1 year, and that the community would rally to help them. Local businesses raced to attach their names to the phenomenon. Lansing Dairy promised a year of free milk. Jacobson's department store donated matching outfits. The local Ford dealership pledged a brand new automobile big enough to carry the family. Radio stations interviewed Dr. Henderson and hospital staff, broadcasting the story to eager audiences across the Midwest. But while the public rejoiced, Carl watched with alarm. Gratitude was not what he felt. Instead, he saw a terrifying loss of control. His private family had become public property overnight. When a local businessman suggested exhibiting the girls at county fairs for money, Carl's paranoia about exploitation twisted into something darker. A merging of fear with his desperate hunger for financial security, even the naming of the quadruplets became a community event. The Lansing State Journal sponsored a contest, drawing over 12,000 submissions. Families debated names at kitchen tables. School children submitted entries as assignments. Civic groups treated the naming like a patriotic duty. The winning entry came from 10-year-old Margaret Sullivan, the daughter of a doctor who had assisted with the delivery. She suggested Edna, Wilma, Sarah, and Helen names, forming the acronym EWSH, matching the initials of Edward W. Sparrow, hospital where they were born. The first 5 years of the quadruplets' lives set the stage for everything that would follow. Patterns of control and exploitation that defined their existence. Sadie, drowning in exhaustion, surrendered more and more authority to Carl. Caring for 4 infants meant she never slept more than 90 minutes at a time. Feedings, changings, illnesses shared simultaneously, was relentless. But rather than help, Carl cast himself as the family's manager, handling publicity and appearances. By their first birthday in 1931, the girls were regulars at community events. They were paraded in a specially designed four-seat stroller, donated by a local carriage company hungry for attention. Dressed in matching outfits that Sadi stitched by hand late into the night, they became Lansing's living mascots to differentiate them. Carl tied ribbons, red for Edna, blue for Wilma, green for Sarah, yellow for Helen. The colors allowed audiences to form favorites, attaching individual personalities to each child exactly as Carl intended. By 18 months, the family moved into a larger home on East Michigan Avenue, funded by appearance fees and gifts. It was modest but respectable. 3 bedrooms, a front porch, and a basement where Carl hoarded memorabilia of the girls' growing fame. He converted one room into his office, meticulously cataloging every photograph, every performance. Every dollar earned, Carl had discovered that his daughters' fame opened doors his accent and working-class background had always kept shut. In 1932, he even ran for local constable, his campaign posters featuring the Quadruplets with the slogan, "A man who can handle 4 can handle anything." The irony would only become clear decades later. When the truth of his handling surfaced, the girls' appearances evolved from church, socials too, choreographed performances, synchronized singing, dancing, reciting poems Carl himself had written. He drilled them for hours, demanding identical expressions, identical movements. Any slip, any spark of individuality brought harsh punishment, always in private. Away from outside eyes, Sadi's role was to sew increasingly elaborate costumes, outfits that thrilled audiences and photographers but cost her nights of sleep. The girls learned to move as one, speak in harmony, and present the facade of sweet, innocent perfection, masking the fear that ruled their private world. Carl monitored every performance, eyes scanning for signs of disobedience. At home, he tightened control further. Locks on the girls' bedroom doors. Letters intercepted, read, and often destroyed. Conversations monitored, sometimes by him listening outside their door, sometimes by interrogating them separately about what they'd said to each other. Even school offered no escape. At Elmwood Elementary, Carl drove them daily, watching recess from outside to monitor interactions. Teachers noticed the girls' strange behavior, nervous, fearful of mistakes, glancing at windows as if expecting someone to be watching, which of course they were. During a 1934 parent conference, their third-grade teacher, Miss Catherine Reynolds, voiced her concern. The girls were isolated, afraid, lacking friendships. Carl exploded, accusing her of corrupting them with modern theories that undermined family authority. As Carl's paranoia deepened, so did the family's isolation. He praised European political movements, emphasizing racial purity and patriarchal rule, collecting German pamphlets that celebrated Nazi ideology. His language about Jews, immigrants, and African Americans grew increasingly venomous, though carefully restrained. When reporters were near, by the time the girls reached their teenage years, their performances took on darker undertones. Songs about feminine purity, odes to obedience and paternal authority, lyrics written by Carl himself. He watched them perform with a disturbing intensity that unsettled even casual observers. By 1948, when the Quadruplets turned 18, the cracks in Carl's perfect image were becoming impossible to ignore. Local reporters who had covered the family for nearly 2 decades began noticing inconsistencies, tension, strain. The flawless harmony now seemed forced, artificial, splintered by discordant moments that hinted at deeper suffering. Sarah, the most outspoken, began showing troubling signs. In interviews, she often trailed off mid-sentence, staring blankly, speaking of watchers and judges no one else could see. On stage, she sometimes sang the wrong lyrics. Breaking their signature harmony, Helen, the youngest by minutes, retreated into near silence. In public, she spoke only when addressed directly, in whispers, so faint audiences strained to hear. Teachers recalled her filling sketchbooks with haunting images, faceless figures, burning houses, children in cages, mouths sewn shut, symbols no adult could decipher. Edna developed paranoid delusions. She became convinced that strangers followed her, or that objects in their home were being swapped with perfect copies. She obsessed over photographs of herself and her sisters, claiming the faces staring back weren't theirs at all but imposters, and Wilma battled insomnia so severe she stayed awake for days, pacing and muttering in a half-language of broken English and German phrases lifted from Carl's political tracts. When she did sleep, her dreams were nightmares, vivid, violent, described in terrifying detail to her sisters. What had once been celebrated as a miracle was unraveling, publicly and irreversibly. Dreams of being trapped in mirrors, or performing for faceless audiences who applauded silently with bleeding hands, haunted the sisters at night. Their physician, Dr. Morrison, had grown increasingly alarmed by these escalating symptoms. Quietly, he began searching through his medical journals for answers. What he discovered pointed toward a disturbing conclusion. All four sisters were showing early signs of what psychiatrists were beginning to call schizophrenia. This condition often emerged in early adulthood, triggered by prolonged stress or trauma. The symmetry of their symptoms was especially unsettling, suggesting either a shared genetic predisposition or, more likely, an environmental factor that had affected them all in the same way. When Dr. Morrison approached Carl with his concerns recommending psychiatric evaluation, perhaps even medication or therapy, Carl erupted with fury. He accused the doctor of conspiring against the family, claiming Jewish psychiatrists and communist sympathizers were using mental health treatments to corrupt American values and tear families apart. He dismissed Morrison immediately, vowing to find a new physician who would respect what he called traditional discipline rather than degenerate theories. Meanwhile, the community's view of the Morlocks was beginning to shift. Rumors of Carl's bizarre behavior reached both law enforcement and social service agencies. His work as a constable had become erratic, often involving long hours parked outside the high school, where he claimed to be watching for degenerate influences. His arrests were increasingly based on his own moral judgments rather than law targeting young couples for minor displays of affection, or harassing immigrants he deemed suspicious. In 1949, a social worker named Helen Rodriguez began investigating reports that the Morlock girls were being unnaturally isolated and subjected to restrictions that bordered on psychological abuse. Her visits to the home were carefully staged by Carl. He presented his daughters as model young women devoted to family and performance. But Rodriguez noticed troubling signs. The girls moved in perfect synchronization, even when unobserved. Their postures and expressions were identical, and often one sister would finish another's sentence in eerie unison. It seemed less like individuality and more like a single identity, carefully shaped for their father's approval. Carl never allowed Rodriguez to speak with the girls privately. He interrupted constantly, answering on their behalf, and grew defensive when she suggested they might benefit from counseling or simple teenage socialization. To him, outsiders were corruptors, trying to break the sacred bond of his family. The breaking point came in late 1950. During a Thanksgiving performance at Lansing Civic Center, the Quadruplets were singing their signature piece, America the Beautiful. Midway through, Edna suddenly stopped, her face contorting with terror. She screamed that the audience was watching us die, and that Father's monsters were hiding behind their faces. At first, the crowd thought it was a theatrical flourish, but her screams grew frantic, filled with rambling references to burning houses, faceless judges, and children trapped in mirrors. Volunteers rushed the stage as the other three sisters continued singing in perfect harmony, ignoring Edna's collapse as though it weren't happening. Carl's response was swift and brutal. Rather than seeking medical care, he locked Edna in the basement for 3 days, dismissing her breakdown as nothing more than feminine hysteria to be cured with isolation and prayer. When she finally reemerged, she was quieter, more obedient but disturbingly detached from reality. The public incident had exposed cracks in the carefully constructed Morlock image. Yet Carl's reaction was to tighten control further. He was convinced that outside forces, Jews, communists, racial degenerates, were waging psychological warfare to destroy his family. In his mind, his daughters symbolized the purity of white Christian America, and any corruption of them would mark civilization's downfall. The house became a fortress. Carl installed new locks on every window and door, hung thick curtains to block prying eyes, and began logging the movements of anyone who approached. He purchased a rifle, claiming it was for hunting, but neighbors noticed him polishing it obsessively on the porch, eyes fixed on the street with twitching paranoia. Inside, his surveillance deepened. Mirrors were positioned strategically so he could monitor his daughters from his basement workshop. Every minute of their day had to be accounted for when he wasn't physically present. Their letters were read, copied, filed, and often destroyed. Carl also instituted disturbing purity inspections, under the guise of medical necessity. He forced his daughters to undergo physical examinations in the basement, which he had converted into a crude medical facility. He filled it with an old hospital examination table, instruments, and charts mapping their physical development, menstrual cycles, and what he called behavioral anomalies. His obsession with their purity was escalating into something far darker. Sadi. Their mother had long since learned not to challenge her husband, but she now showed visible signs of despair. Neighbors often saw her staring blankly from the window for hours, her once vibrant appearance replaced by weight loss, hollow eyes, and the premature aging of someone crushed by years of unrelenting stress. When approached, she insisted everything was normal, parroting lines about family values as though rehearsed. She seemed terrified of being overheard. The sisters, too, adapted in disturbing ways. They developed a shared delusional system, believing they were constantly watched by invisible judges who punished disobedience. Even in private, their conversations sounded scripted, filled with whispered warnings about watchers, corruptors, and infiltrators who tested their loyalty to father and family. The family's new physician, Dr. Peterson, was young, inexperienced, and easily intimidated by Carl's authoritarian presence. When the girls showed signs of severe breakdowns, hallucinations, catatonic silences, uncontrollable crying, he chalked it up to female sensitivity. His notes, later subpoenaed, described them as high-strung, but never questioned Carl's control or the bizarre restrictions in the home. By now, whispers of dysfunction spread through the community, but Carl's reputation and political connections shielded him. He dismissed critics as jealous neighbors or troublemakers. Then, in early 1952, a chance arrival changed everything. Dr. Benjamin Strauss, a psychiatrist and refugee from Nazi Germany, visited Lansing to lecture on advances in mental health. Having heard troubling rumors about the famous Quadruplets, he stopped by the Morlock home. At first, Carl greeted him with forced civility, but when Strauss asked questions about the girl's behavior and suggested professional evaluation, Carl exploded. On the front porch, where neighbors could hear, he railed about Jewish conspiracies, declaring Hitler should have finished the job and predicting America's need for its own final solution. Shaken, Dr. Strauss immediately contacted state mental health authorities and law enforcement. His detailed report described clear evidence of psychological abuse, possible physical harm, and a family in crisis. He urged immediate intervention, warning that delay could result in permanent damage or violence. On the morning of April 15, 1952, state investigators and sheriff's deputies descended on the Morlock home with legal authority to conduct welfare checks. Leading the team was Dr. Margaret Collins, a psychiatric social worker with years of experience in family dysfunction, and Detective Raymond Murphy, a veteran officer specializing in crimes against children. What they found inside would shock even the most seasoned professionals. The investigators who entered the Morlock home were seasoned professionals, people who thought they had already seen every form of family dysfunction imaginable. From the outside, the house looked perfectly ordinary, freshly painted, carefully maintained, with a neat garden suggesting pride and ownership. But the inside told a very different story. The moment they stepped through the door, it became clear this was not a normal home. It had been transformed into something that felt more like a prison or even a laboratory. The living spaces were sparse, almost sterile. Furniture was positioned with deliberate precision, arranged so that Karl could observe every movement in the house from his chair. Religious images filled the walls, but many of these pictures had been altered by Karl's own hand. Biblical verses were scribbled over with his handwriting, twisted into justifications for absolute paternal authority and racial purity. Family photos lined the halls, but even they followed a disturbing order. Images of the girls were grouped to track their physical development, each annotated with Karl's obsessive notes. The basement revealed the true horror. For years, Karl had kept it locked, insisting it was off-limits. When investigators forced the door open and descended the creaking wooden stairs, they discovered a hidden world of paranoia and abuse. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs of the girls, taken in secret through windows, mirrors, and doorways. Every moment of their lives had been captured with chilling detail. These images were carefully organized, one section for each daughter, further broken down into categories like physical development, social interactions, even so-called behavioral anomalies. Some photographs showed the girls partially undressed, clearly taken during what Karl called medical examinations. Investigators quickly realized this was not parental concern. It was surveillance and exploitation, meticulously carried out over years. Dozens of notebooks filled shelves in the basement. Each was crammed with Karl's handwritten logs, daily conversations, menstrual cycles, sleep patterns, even bathroom habits. Nothing was too private, nothing left unrecorded. More disturbing still, these notes were laced with references to Nazi ideology, eugenics, and racial purity. Karl analyzed his own daughters as if they were specimens, judging which ones showed degenerate tendencies, theorizing how outsiders were corrupting their so-called genetic inheritance. The basement even contained an examination table Karl had ordered from a hospital supply company. Next to it lay instruments he claimed were for monitoring the girls' health. In reality, investigators concluded these were tools of violation and control. Detailed charts hung nearby, documenting what Karl labeled purity measurements and contamination indicators. Detective Murphy uncovered a locked cabinet filled with even more disturbing evidence. Correspondence with white supremacist groups, Nazi propaganda, and his written plans for protective measures in case of an attack from supposed racial enemies. Alongside these were personal belongings of his daughters, taken without their knowledge. Further proof of his obsession with control. Upstairs, the girls' bedrooms painted the same picture. Every wall was plastered with Karl's rules, handwritten instructions on how to bathe, how to eat, how to sit, even how to speak to strangers. Their clothes were locked away, selected daily by Karl. He inspected each garment for stains or signs of disobedience, going so far as to examine their undergarments, hidden beneath mattresses. Investigators discovered coded journals written by the girls themselves. It took cryptographers weeks to decipher the writing. What emerged was heartbreaking. These journals revealed the extent of their psychological collapse. In their coded language, the girls described the constant watchers and invisible judges who scrutinized their every move. They tried to escape their father's grip through secret writing, but even their private thoughts were poisoned by his paranoia. Sarah wrote of escape and revenge, but also described moments where she felt detached from reality, watching her life unfold from outside her own body. Helen's journal revealed a world of imaginary companions who protected her from the watchers. But she also confessed to uncontrollable rages and violent fantasies. Edna's writings suggested a total break from reality. She described shifting faces, parallel dimensions, and duplicate realities. Wilma's entries focused obsessively on performance and perfection. She lived in terror of making a mistake that might bring punishment, sometimes lapsing into catatonic withdrawal. When investigators finally interviewed Karl, his delusions spilled out without hesitation. He ranted about international conspiracies of Jewish psychiatrists and racial degenerates. He insisted that his strict control was the only thing preserving his daughter's purity. He claimed psychiatric treatment itself was a weapon against families like his. For the first time, he openly praised Hitler's policies, insisting America needed its own program to eliminate genetic defectives. To him, His daughters were not children, they were research subjects, tools in his twisted study of racial purity. Sadi, questioned separately, confirmed the horror. She had endured years of abuse herself while trying in vain to shield her daughters. She described Carl's growing violence whenever she questioned his methods, his obsessive tightening of control, and her failed attempts to seek help. The respectable image Carl projected in public had silenced her pleas. She had lived under constant threat, knowing any effort to expose him would only worsen the girl's suffering. The daughters, when separated from their father, struggled to communicate with investigators. Years of psychological conditioning had left them unable to separate truth from Carl's delusions. Their answers were contradictory, confused. Marked by trauma, Dr. Collins identified symptoms now recognized as complex PTSD, dissociation, hypervigilance, social withdrawal. They had lived so long in Carl's artificial world that reality itself felt suspect. Within hours, the decision was made. The girls would be removed, placed under psychiatric care, and Carl arrested. Charges of child abuse, sexual assault, and endangerment ended the Morlock Quadruplets' public performance career and began their transformation into case studies of American psychiatry. The fallout shook entire institutions. Communities, law enforcement, and social services all faced questions about how such systematic abuse could go undetected. At the same time, the newly established National Institute of Mental Health saw in the Morlock case an unprecedented opportunity. 4 genetically identical sisters, all showing symptoms of schizophrenia, raised in the same environment. For ambitious psychiatrists, this was the perfect natural experiment. Dr. David Rosenthal, a rising figure at NIMH, quickly argued that studying the sisters could finally settle the debate. Were psychiatric disorders hereditary or environmental? The decision to use them as research subjects was made swiftly, with little thought given to ethics. Their consent was irrelevant compared to the promise of scientific advancement to conceal their identities. Researchers gave them a pseudonym derived from the Greek for dreadful birth, a cruel irony. Considering their history, in the summer of 1952, the Quadruplets were taken to Bethesda, Maryland, to begin the next chapter of their exploitation. For the first time, they were separated from their parents and from each other. At the National Institute of Mental Health, the Quadruplets entered a new phase of surveillance and control. The NIMH facility was a sprawling complex of modern buildings, carefully designed to project an image of medical authority and cutting-edge science. The sisters were placed in a special ward for long-term research subjects. Their rooms were comfortable, even pleasant on the surface, but the constant monitoring brought back haunting echoes of their father's watchful eye. The first evaluations confirmed what investigators already suspected. All 4 sisters showed signs of schizophrenia. Though their symptoms varied in severity, Sarah displayed the strongest social functioning. Her intelligence and resilience allowed her to preserve fragments of independent thought. And eventually, she was able to live with only minimal supervision. Edna suffered more severe symptoms, but remained grounded enough to participate in treatment programs. Wilma was plagued by crippling anxiety and perfectionism, making ordinary social life almost impossible. Helen's case was the most severe, her psychosis so deep that she would spend the majority of her adult life in institutions. But the researchers overlooked something critical. They downplayed the impact of Carl Morlock's abuse and extremist ideology. In the official reports, his years of surveillance, control, and indoctrination were treated as footnotes rather than central causes of the girl's psychological decline. Instead, the studies leaned heavily toward genetics, reflecting the biases of 1950s psychiatry. At the time, psychoanalytic theories often blamed mothers for mental illness, while fathers, roles even abusive ones, were minimized or ignored. Much of the analysis centered on Sadi's personality and parenting style, while Carl's fascist obsessions barely registered in the findings. Dr. David Rosenthal and his colleagues fixated on genetics. They saw the sisters' shared diagnosis as proof that schizophrenia was hereditary. Environmental factors, years of abuse, isolation, and indoctrination were cast aside. The quadruplets became a cornerstone for research that pushed psychiatry toward a biological model, ignoring the trauma that had clearly shaped their development. In 1963, a massive 600-page study on the sisters was published. It was hailed as a landmark in psychiatric literature, cited worldwide as evidence that mental illness was biological at its root. The book gave Rosenthal international prestige, cementing his reputation as a leading voice in psychiatric genetics. Yet critics noted what was missing: the study's refusal to acknowledge how abuse, trauma, and extremist ideology had shaped the girls' lives. Meanwhile, Karl Morlock paid a shockingly small price. Convicted only of charges related to physical abuse and neglect, he served less than 2 years in prison. At the time, the legal system had little framework for prosecuting psychological abuse, and the full extent of his crimes was never truly addressed. After his release in 1954, Karl vanished from public view. Whispers connected him to white supremacist networks. He never expressed remorse, continuing to insist his methods were both moral and scientific. Sadi, broken by years of abuse, lived quietly in Lansing until her death in 1967. She rarely saw her daughters again. The guilt of her silence and her inability to shield them followed her to the grave. The quadruplets lives after NIMH diverged. Sarah proved the most resilient. She married Robert Cotton, a social worker who had been part of her care team, and together they built a fragile but real family. She bore 2 sons, who showed no signs of mental illness, contradicting the very genetic theories her family had been used to support. Sarah became an outspoken advocate for psychiatric patients' rights, calling out both the media and the scientific community for exploiting her family. Edna and Wilma lived in and out of psychiatric institutions for decades. New medications brought stability, but never full recovery. They remained close to Sarah, joining her for family gatherings when their conditions allowed. Helen, however, never escaped institutional life. She found some peace through art therapy and creative writing, expressing visions and memories that words alone couldn't capture. Her work provided haunting glimpses into the inner world of someone scarred by trauma, but still capable of beauty and imagination. The research didn't end. Through the 1980s and 1990s, follow-up studies tracked the sisters' health, their children, even their grandchildren. Again and again, the data was used to highlight genetics, yet over time, a more complicated picture emerged. Environmental trauma mattered. Abuse mattered. Isolation mattered. Some later researchers began revisiting the case, finally acknowledging that the sisters' illnesses might have been preventable if they had been rescued from Karl sooner. Today, only Sarah survives. Now in her 90s, living in a care facility near her children, she has begun to speak more openly. She worked with author Audrey Claire Farley to set the record straight to ensure that her family's story included the racism, the abuse, and the exploitation that shaped every part of their lives. Sarah argues forcefully that ignoring Karl's Nazi ideology was a grave mistake. His extremism wasn't a footnote. It was the foundation of their destruction. The Morlock quadruplets story remains a chilling reminder of how easily science can be twisted. Their case challenges us to question the price of progress and the responsibility of institutions to protect, not exploit. Modern research ethics, consent, oversight, protections for vulnerable subjects exist partly because of tragedies like theirs. Their story also warns of something larger: how fascist ideologies can hide inside seemingly ordinary families, cloaked in respectability, shielded by authority. Karl Morlock managed to maintain a public facade while building a private world of fascism, abuse, and control. And for too long, a community and even an entire discipline looked away. So what do you think? How could a family suffer like this, in plain sight, without intervention? Could stronger systems have stopped it, or were the social attitudes of the time too willing to excuse a father's authority, no matter the cost? If you found this story disturbing, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We'll continue to uncover America's darkest historical mysteries, because sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't strangers at all. They're the ones living quietly among us. Shielded by respectability, science and silence,